We turn now to the growing violence in Syria. This morning, thousands are chanting, "Overthrow the regime," at funerals for protesters killed on Friday. It was the bloodiest day yet in the month-long uprising. Security forces fired into the crowds, killing at least 88 people. President Obama denounced the bloodshed, saying the United States condemns in the strongest possible terms the use of force by the Syrian government against demonstrators. This outrageous use of violence to quell protests must come to an end right now. Joining us from Washington is CBS News national security analyst Juan Zarate. Juan, good morning to you.
Good morning, Russ.
President Assad has been all over the place in the way he deals with these protesters. Why do you think yesterday became so violent?
Well, I think what you've seen, Russ, is an escalating, vicious cycle of protests and repression by the regime. Assad has tried to placate the protesters and relieve pressure by declaring that the emergency law no longer is going to be in place, allowing protests. But the reality is they want to hold on to power. And as the protests have grown, the repression has grown as well. And so that's why you've seen escalating violence over the last month and a half, brought to a head yesterday, which may be a tipping point, as we're seeing today with more protests in Syria.
How did the government has gone down this road? Do you expect this sort of violence to continue?
Absolutely. I don't see this abating anytime soon. What you've seen over the past month and a half has been the protests spreading throughout Syria, including to the suburbs of Damascus. You've seen the repression in various parts of Syria increasing. You're now seeing the YouTube videos of the troops and security forces firing on the protesters. And I see this as just increasing over time and reaching a real tipping point in terms of the violence that we're seeing in Syria.
Of course, Syria shares a border with Israel. How nervous are folks in Israel this morning?
Well, I think Israel's quite nervous about the instability in the region writ large. Certainly, there's no love lost for the Assad regime, a regime that is a friend and a proxy for Iran, that houses groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But the problem for Israel is this is the devil they know. They are also worried about the instability that follows if, for example, the Assad regime falls. And so Israel's quite worried about the enemies at their borders and the instability around in their neighborhood. And I think they're very wary about what's happening in the region, hoping for the best, but not quite sure what happens next.
Two good questions. We just pointed out that President Obama condemned the attacks by the government yesterday. Do you see a point where the international community and the U.S. specifically has to step in from a military standpoint?
Well, I'm not so sure militarily, but I think there will be a point here very shortly once the violence continues to increase, and we're going to see more and more images of that, where the administration and the international community is going to have to not only say more, but do more. And there's more that can be done other than militarily. We have a diplomat, an ambassador in Damascus. He can be recalled. There can be a human rights campaign. We can search for the assets of the Assad regime and their cronies. There's a whole host of pressure points that we haven't placed on the regime yet that could be part of a declaration of the illegitimacy of the Assad regime that hasn't happened yet. So I think that's to come.
Juan Zarate joining us from Washington. As always, thanks a lot. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Russ.